Bleak House by Charles Dickens, Chapter 8, Covering a Multitude of Sins. It was interesting, when I dressed before daylight, to peep out of window, and finding all beyond still enshrouded in the indistinctness of last night, to watch how it turned out when the day came on. As the prospect gradually revealed itself, I had a pleasure in discovering the unknown objects that had been around me in my sleep. At first they were faintly discernible in the mist, and above them the later stars still glimmered. Imperceptibly, the dark places in my room all melted away, and the day shone bright upon a cheerful landscape, prominent in which the old abbey church, with its massive tower, threw a soft train of shadow on the view that seemed compatible with its rugged character. Every part of the house was in such order, and every one was attentive to me, that I had no trouble with my 2 bunches of keys, though what with trying to remember the contents of each little storeroom drawer and cupboard, and what with making notes on a slate about jams and pickles and preserves and bottles and glass and china, and a great many other things, and what with being generally a methodical, old-maidish sort of foolish little person, I was so busy that I could not believe it was breakfast time when I heard the bell ring. Away I ran, however, and made tea, as I had already been installed into the responsibility of the teapot, and then, as they were all rather late, and nobody was down yet, I thought I would take a peep at the garden. I found it quite a delightful place. In front, the pretty avenue and drive by which we had approached. At the back, the flower garden, with my darling at her window up there, throwing it open to smile out at me. Beyond the flower garden was a kitchen garden, and then a paddock, and then a snug little rickyard, and then a dear little farmyard. As to the house itself, with its 3 peaks in the roof, its various shaped windows, some so large, some so small, and all so pretty, its trellis work against the south front for roses and honeysuckle, and its homely, comfortable, welcoming look, it was, as Ada said when she came out to meet me with her arm through that of its master, worthy of her cousin John, a bold thing to say, though he only pinched her dear cheek for it. My new duties occupied me for some time, and I was passing through the passages on my return with my basket of keys on my arm when Mr. Jarndyce called me into a small room next to his bedchamber, which I found to be part of a little library of books and papers, and in part quite a little museum of his boots, shoes, and hat boxes. "Sit down, my dear," said Mr. Jarndyce. "This is the growlery. When I am out of humour, I come and growl here." "You must be here very seldom, sir," said I. "Oh, you don't know me," he returned. "When I am deceived or disappointed in the wind, and it's easterly, I take refuge here. The growlery is the best used room in the house. You are not aware of half my humours yet, my dear. How you are trembling!" I could not help it. I tried very hard, but being alone with that benevolent presence, and meeting his kind eyes, and feeling so happy and honoured there, and my heart so full, I kissed his hand. I don't know what I said, or even that I spoke. He was disconcerted and walked to the window. I almost believed with an intention of jumping out until he turned, and I was reassured by seeing in his eyes that he had gone there to hide. He gently patted me on the head, and I sat down. There, he said. "That's over. Pooh, don't be foolish." "It shall not happen again, sir," I returned. "But first, it is difficult." "Nonsense," he said. "It's easy. Why not? I hear of a good little orphan girl without a protector, and I take it into my head to be that protector. She grows up, and more than justifies my good opinion, and I remain her guardian and her friend. What is there in all this? So, now we have cleared off old scores, and I have before me thy pleasant, trusting, trusty face again." I said to myself, "Esther, my dear, you surprise me. This really is not what I expected of you." And it had quite a good effect. And it had such a good effect that I folded my hands upon my basket and quite recovered myself. Mr. Jarndyce expressing his approval in his face, began to talk to me as confidently as if I had been in the habit of conversing with him every morning for I don't know how long. I almost felt as if I had. "Of course, Esther," he said, "you don't understand this chancery business." And of course I shook my head. "I don't know who does," he returned. "The lawyers have twisted it into such a state of bedevilment that the original merits of the case have long disappeared from the face of the earth. There's a will, and trusts under a will, or it was once. And it's nothing but costs now. We are always appearing and disappearing and swearing and interrogating and filing and cross-filing and arguing and sealing and motioning and referring and reporting and revolving about the Lord Chancellor and all his satellites and equitably waltzing ourselves off to dusty death about costs. That's the great question. All the rest, by some extraordinary means, has melted away." "But it was, sir," said I, "about a will?" "Why, yes, it was about a will when it was about anything," he returned. "A certain jaundice, in an evil hour, made a great fortune and made a great will. In the question how the trusts under the will are to be administered, the fortune left by the will is squandered away. The legatees under the will are reduced to such a miserable condition that they would be sufficiently punished if they had committed an enormous crime in having money left them, and the will itself made a dead letter, all through the deplorable cause. Everything that everybody in it except one man knows already is referred to that only one man who don't know it to find out. All through the deplorable cause, everybody must have copies, over and over again, of everything that has accumulated about it, and in the way of cartloads of papers, and must go down the middle and up again, through such an infernal country dance of costs and fees and nonsense and corruption as was never dreamed of in the wildest visions of a witch's Sabbath. Equity sends questions to law. Law sends questions back to equity. Law finds it can't do this. Equity finds it can't do that. Neither can so much as say it can't do anything without this solicitor instructing, and this counsel appearing for A, and this solicitor instructing, and that counsel appearing for B, and so on through the whole alphabet, like the history of apple pie. And thus, through years and years and lives, everything goes on, constantly beginning over and over again, and nothing ever ends, and we can't get out of the suit on any terms, for we are made parties to it, and must be parties to it, whether we like it or not. But it won't do to think of it. When my great-uncle, poor Tom Jaundice, began to think of it, it was the beginning of the end. "The Mr. Jaundice, sir, whose story I have heard?" He nodded gravely. "I was his heir, and this was his house, Esther. When I came here, it was bleak indeed. He had left the signs of his misery upon it." "How changed it must be now," I said. "It had been called, before his time, the Peaks. He gave it its present name, and lived here shut up day and night, poring over the wicked heaps of papers in the suit, and hoping against hope to disentangle it from its mystification and bring it to a close. In the meantime, the place became dilapidated. The weeds choked the passage to the rotting door. When I brought what remained of him home here, the brains seemed to me to have been blown out of the house too. It was so shattered and ruined." He walked a little to and fro after saying this to himself with a shudder, and then looked at me and brightened, and came and sat down again with his hands in his pockets. "I told you this was the growlery, my dear. Where was I?" I reminded him at the hopeful change he had made in Bleak House. "Bleak House, true. There is, in the city of London, some property of ours, which is much at this day what Bleak House was then. A property of ours, meaning of the suits, but I ought to call the property of costs, for costs is the only power on earth that will get anything out of it now, or will ever know it for anything but an eyesore and a heartsore. It is a street of perishing blind houses, with their eyes stoned out, without a pane of glass, without so much as a window frame. Although Bleak House was not in Chancery, its master was, and it was stamped with the same seal. These are the great seal's impressions, my dear. All over England the children know them. There are things I never talk about, or even think about, excepting in the growlery here. If you consider it right to mention them to Rick and Ada, looking seriously at me, you can. I leave it to your discretion, Esther. I hope, sir, said I think you had better call me guardian, my dear. I felt that I was choking again when he feigned to say this slightly, as if it were a whim instead of a thoughtful tenderness. But I gave the housekeeping keys the least shake in the world as a reminder to myself, and looked at him quietly. I hope, guardian, said I, that you may not trust too much to my discretion. I am afraid it will be a disappointment to you to know that I am not clever, but it really is the truth, and you would soon find it out if I had not the honesty to confess it. He did not seem at all disappointed. Quite the contrary. He told me, with a smile all over his face, that he knew me very well indeed, and that I was quite clever enough for him. I hope I may turn out so, said I, but I am much afraid of it, guardian. You are clever enough to be the good little woman of our lives here, my dear, he returned playfully. The old woman of the child's rhyme, little old woman, and wither so high to sweep the cobwebs out of the sky. You will sweep them so neatly out of our sky in the course of your housekeeping, Esther, that one of these days we shall have to abandon the growlery and nail up the door. This was the beginning of my being called old woman and little old woman and cobweb and Mrs. Shipton and Mother Hubbard and Dame Durden, and so many names of that sort that my own name soon became quite lost among them. However, said Mr. Jarndyce, to return to our gossip, here's Rick, a fine young fellow full of promise. What's to be done about him? Here is Esther. He must have a profession. He must make some choice for himself. There will be a world more wigglomeration about it, I suppose, but it must be done. What more, guardian? Said I. More what, guardian? Said I. More wigglomeration, said he. It's the only name I know for the thing. He was a ward in Chancery, my dear. Kenge and Carboy will have something to say about it. Master Somebody will have something to say about it. Council will have something to say about it. The Chancellor will have something to say about it. The satellites will have something to say about it. They will all have to be handsomely feed all round about it. The whole thing will be vastly ceremonious, worldly, unsatisfactory, and expensive, and I call it, in general, wigglomeration. How mankind ever came to be afflicted by wigglomeration, or for whose sins these young people ever fell into a pit of it, I don't know, so it is. He began to rub his head, and to hint that he felt the wind, but it was a delightful instance of his kindness toward me that whether he rubbed his head or walked about or did both, his face was sure to recover its benignant expression as it looked at mine, and he was sure to turn comfortable again. Perhaps it would be best first of all, said I, to ask Mr. Richard what he inclines to himself. Exactly so, he returned. That's what I mean. You know, just accustom yourself to talk it over, with your tact and in your quiet way, with him and Ada, and see what you all make of it. We are sure to come at the heart of the matter by your means, little woman. I had not meant this at all. I had meant that he should speak to Richard. But of course I said I would do my best, though I feared, I really felt it necessary to repeat this, that he thought me much more sagacious than I was, at which my guardian only laughed, the pleasantest laugh I ever heard. Come, he said, rising and pushing back his chair. I think we may have done with the growlery for one day. Only a concluding word, Esther, my dear. Do you wish to ask me anything?" He looked so attentively at me that I looked attentively at him and felt sure I understood him. "About myself, sir?" said I. "Yes." "Guardian," said I, venturing to put my hand, which was suddenly colder than I could have wished it in his. "Nothing. I am quite sure that if there was anything I ought to know, or had any need to know, I should not have to ask you to tell it to me. If my whole reliance and confidence were not placed in you, I would have a hard heart indeed. I have nothing to ask you, nothing in the world." He drew my hand through his arm, and we went away to look for Ada. From that hour I felt quite easy with him, quite unreserved, quite content to know no more, quite happy. We lived at first rather a busy life at Bleak House, for we had to become acquainted with many residents in it and out of the neighborhood who knew Mr. Jarndyce. It seemed to Ada and me that everybody knew him who wanted to do anything with anybody else's money. It amazed us when we began to sort his letters and to answer some of them for him in the growlery of a morning, to find how the great object of the lives of nearly all his correspondents appeared to form themselves into committees for getting in and laying out money. The ladies were as desperate as the gentlemen. Indeed, I think they were even more so. They wanted everything. They wanted wearing apparel, they wanted linen rags, they wanted money, they wanted coals, they wanted soup, they wanted interest, they wanted autographs, they wanted flannel, they wanted whatever Mr. Jarndyce had or had not. Their objects were as various as their demands. They were going to raise new buildings, they were going to pay off debts on old buildings, they were going to give a testimonial to Mrs. Jellyby. They appeared to be always excited about canvassing and electing. Among the ladies who were most distinguished for this rapturous benevolence, if I may use the expression, was a Mrs. Pardiggle, who seemed, as I judged, from the number of her letters to Mr. Jarndyce, to be almost as powerful a correspondent as Mrs. Jellyby herself. We observed that the wind always changed when Mrs. Pardiggle became the subject of conversation. We were therefore curious to see Mrs. Pardiggle, and were glad when she called one day with her 5 young sons. As only Ada and I were at home, we received her timidly, for she seemed to come in like cold weather, and to make the little Pardiggles blue as they followed. "These young ladies," said Mrs. Pardiggle with great volubility after first salutations. "Oh, these young ladies," said Mrs. Pardiggle with great volubility after first salutation, "are my 5 boys." We had never seen such dissatisfied children. It was not merely that they were weazened and shriveled, though they were certainly that too, but they looked absolutely ferocious with discontent. "You have been visiting, I understand," said Mrs. Pardiggle, "at Mrs. Jellyby's." We said yes, we had passed one night there. "Mrs. Jellyby," pursued the lady, always speaking in the same demonstrative, loud, hard tone, "is a benefactor to society and deserves a helping hand by this time, young ladies," said Mrs. Pardiggle. "You have found me out, I dare say." This was really such a confusing question that Ada looked at me in perfect dismay. "Found out, I mean," said Mrs. Pardiggle. "The prominent point of my character. I am aware that it is so prominent as to be discoverable immediately. I lay myself open to detection, I know. Well, I freely admit I'm a woman of business. I love hard work. I enjoy hard work. I am so accustomed and inured to hard work that I don't know what fatigue is." We murmured that it was astonishing and very gratifying, or something to that effect. "I do not understand what it is to be tired. You cannot tire me if you try," said Mrs. Pardiggle. "Miss Summerson, I hope I shall have your assistance in my visiting rounds immediately, and Miss Clare's very soon. At first I tried to excuse myself for the present on the general ground of having occupations to attend to which I must not neglect, but, as this was an ineffectual protest, I then said more particularly that I was not sure of my qualifications, that I was inexperienced in the art of adapting my mind to minds very differently situated and addressing them from suitable points of view, that I had much to learn myself before I could teach others, and that I could not confide in my good interests alone. For these reasons, I thought it best to be as useful as I could, and to render what kind services I could to those immediately about me, and to try and let that circle of duty gradually and naturally expand itself. "You are wrong, Mrs. Summerson," said she, "but perhaps you are not equal to hard work, or the excitement of it, and that makes a vast difference. If you would like to see how I go through my work, I am now about, with my young family, to visit a brickmaker in the neighbourhood, and shall be glad to take you with me, Miss Clare also, if she will do me the favour." Ada and I interchanged looks, and as we were going out in any case, accepted the offer. When we hastily returned from putting on our bonnets, Mrs. Pardiggle took possession of Ada, and I followed with the family. The brickmaker's house was one of a cluster of wretched hovels in a brick-field, with pigsties close to the broken windows, and miserable little gardens before the doors, growing nothing but stagnant pools. Mrs. Pardiggle, leading the way with a great show of moral determination, conducted us into a cottage at the farthest corner, the ground-floor room of which we nearly filled. Besides ourselves, there were in this damp, offensive room a woman with a black eye nursing a poor little gasping baby by the fire, a man all stained with clay and mud and looking very dissipated, lying at full length on the ground, smoking a pipe, a powerful young man fastening a collar on a dog, and a bold girl doing some kind of washing in very dirty water. They all looked up at us as we came in, and the woman seemed to turn her face toward the fire as if to hide her bruised eye. Nobody gave us any welcome. "Well, my friends," said Mrs. Pardiggle, but her voice had not a friendly sound. I thought it was much too businesslike and systemic. "How do you do, all of you? I am here again. I told you you couldn't tire me, you know. I am fond of hard work, and I am true to my word." "There isn't," growled the man on the floor, whose head rested on his hand as he stared at us. "Any more on you to come in, is there?" "No, my friend," said Mrs. Pardiggle, seating herself on one stool and knocking down another. We are all here." "Because I thought there wasn't enough of you, perhaps," said the man with his pipe between his lips, as he looked round at us. "You can't tire me, good people," said Mrs. Pardiggle. "I enjoy hard work, and the harder you make mine, the better I like it." Mrs. Pardiggle pulled out a good book, as if it were a constable's staff, and took the whole family into custody. I mean into religious custody, of course, but she really did it as if she were an inexorable moral policeman, carrying all of them off to a station house. Ada and I were very uncomfortable. We both felt intrusive and out of place, and we both thought that Mrs. Pardiggle would have got on infinitely better if she had not had such a mechanical way of taking possession of people. We were much relieved under these circumstances when Mrs. Pardiggle left off. The man on the floor then, turning his head round again, said morosely, "Well, you've done, have you?" "For today I have, my friend, but I am never fatigued. I shall come for you again in your regular order," returned Mrs. Pardiggle with demonstrative cheerfulness. "As long as you goes now," he said, folding his arms and shutting his eyes with an oath. "You may do what you like." Mrs. Pardiggle accordingly rose, and she proceeded to another cottage. She supposed that we were following her, but as soon as the space was left clear, we approached the woman sitting by the fire to ask if the baby were ill. She only looked at it as it lay on her lap. We had observed before that when she looked at it, she covered her discolored eye with her hand, as though she wished to separate any association with noise and violence and ill-treatment from the poor little child. Ada whose gentle heart was moved by its appearance, bent down to touch its little face. As she did so, I saw what happened and drew her back. The child died. "Oh, Esther!" cried Ada, sinking on her knees beside it. "Look here! Oh, Esther, my love! The suffering, quiet, pretty little thing! I am so sorry for it! I am so sorry for the mother! I never saw a sight so pitiful as this before! Oh, baby, baby!" Such compassion, such gentleness as that with which she bent down weeping and put her hand upon the mother's might have softened any mother's heart that ever beat. The woman at first gazed at her in astonishment, and then burst into tears. Presently I took the light burden from her lap, did what I could to make the baby's rest prettier and gentler, laid it on a shelf, and covered it with my own handkerchief. We tried to comfort the mother, and we whispered to her what our Saviour said of children. She answered nothing, but sat weeping, weeping very much. When I turned, I found that the young man had taken out the dog, and was standing at the door looking in upon us with dry eyes but quiet. The man had risen. He still smoked his pipe with an air of defiance, but he was silent. An ugly woman, very poorly clothed, hurried in while I was glancing at them, and coming straight up to the mother, said, "Jenny, Jenny!" The mother rose on being so addressed and fell upon the woman's neck. She also had upon her face and arms the marks of ill usage. She had no kind of grace about her but the grace of sympathy. But when she condoled with the woman and her own tears fell, she wanted no beauty. I say condoled, but her only words were, "Jenny, Jenny." All the rest was in the tone in which she said them. I thought it very touching to see these two women, coarse and shabby and beaten, so united, to see what they could be to one another, to see how they felt for one another. I think the best side of such people is almost hidden from us. What the poor are to the poor is little known except to themselves and God. We felt better to withdraw and leave them uninterrupted. We stole out quietly and without notice from anyone except the man. He was leaning against the wall near the door, and finding that there was scarcely room for us to pass, went out before us. Ada was so full of grief all the way home, and Richard, whom we found at home, was so distressed to see her in tears that we arranged to return at night with some little comforts and repeat our visit at the brickmaker's house. We said as little as we could to Mr. Jarndyce, but the wind changed directly. Richard accompanied us at night to the scene of our morning expedition. On our way there, we had to pass a noisy drinking house, where a number of men were flocking about the door. Among them, and prominent in some dispute, was the father of the little child. We left our escort within sight of the brickmaker's dwelling, and proceeded by ourselves. When we came to the door, we found the woman who had brought such consolation within her, standing there, looking anxiously out. "It's you young ladies, is it?" she said in a whisper. "I'm a-watching for my master. My heart's in my mouth. If he was to catch me away from home, he'd pretty near murder me." "Do you mean your husband?" said I. "Yes, miss, my master. Jenny's asleep, quite worn out. She's scarcely had the child off her lap, poor thing, these 7 days and nights, except when I've been able to take it for a minute or two." As she gave way for us, she went softly in and put what we had brought near the miserable bed in which the mother slept. No effort had been made to clean the room, but the small waxen form, from which so much solemnity diffused itself, had been composed afresh, and washed and neatly dressed in some fragments of white linen, and on my handkerchief, which still covered the poor baby, a little bunch of sweet herbs had been laid at the same by the same rough-scarred hands, so lightly, so tenderly. "May heaven reward you," we said to her. "You are a good woman." "Me, young ladies," she returned with surprise. "Hush, Jenny, Jenny." The mother had moaned in her sleep and moved. The sound of the familiar voice seemed to calm her again. She was quiet once more. How little I thought, when I raised my handkerchief to look upon the tiny sleeper underneath, and seemed to see a halo shine around the child, through Ada's drooping hair, at her pity bent head, how little I thought in whose unquiet bosom that handkerchief would come to lie. I only thought that perhaps the angel of the child might not be unconscious of the woman who replaced it with so compassionate a hand, not all unconscious of her presently, when we had taken leave and left her at the door by turns, looking and listening in terror for herself, and saying in her old soothing manner, "Jenny, Jenny." And that is the end of chapter 8.